I'm in college now, but this happened to me and a small group of my friends about 4 years ago when we were 16. We all lived in a small town in rural Arkansas which had a massive high school that served us and other surrounding towns. It was late December this one year and we had broke up for Christmas. During the few days after Christmas, the week where you don't know what to do and everything is really slow during the build up to New Year, me and 3 of my friends, John, Lee and Shane, all decided to break into our school to play with a Ouija board. There had been stories floating around for as long as I could remember about our school being haunted and all the misfortunes and drama that had occurred there. We believed none of it and decided we would check it out for ourselves. Breaking in was pretty easy and we found ourselves in the assembly theatre. The seats in the theatre were designed so they could be dragged back and stacked against a wall, each row above the other. The staff had done this for Christmas break, so the assembly room was just a stage and an empty patch of floor. John went into the corridor and returned with a small table. Me and Shane salvaged some chairs for us to use and I pulled 2 candles out of my bag. I'd read that they are perfect for helping with spirit communication. Lee supplied the board, an old heavy wooden one that his parents had used when they were kids. Looking back, this was probably a bad call and we should have just bought a new one. He placed it on the table and then fished the planchette out of his bag. We all made a pact not to influence the board falsely in any way, and to this end, I still trust all of my friends. We were jokers, but we were an honest bunch. We each put our hands on the planchette and all looked at each other, wondering who was ballsy enough to speak out first. It was Shane. He asked the simple question, "Is anyone here with us?" Nothing happened. Not even a shake. He repeated the question and we all waited a moment. Again, nothing. We were all already skeptical from the start, but we were beginning to think all the stories had been just stories. I was the one who decided to ask the next question, and I asked if anyone had died on the land on which the school was built. Again, we all waited a moment, and again, nothing happened. We decided to take our hands off of the planchette and sat talking for a while. We figured we might have a walk around and see if anything creepy would happen to us. We had barely even glanced at the planchette and Ouija board, nor had we called out to any potential spirits when, seemingly out of nothing, the 2 candles blew out. All 4 of us agree there was no breeze strong enough to cause that. We all sort of screamed. It sounds pathetic, but it was more of the shock of it all. It was pretty much totally dark for us all as our eyes hadn't had time to adjust when I heard a long, deep exhale from the doorway. None of my friends were stood there. I was terrified as that was the only way out. We all stood and Lee threw the board and planchette into his bag. I went to blindly pick up the candles. I got one, but the other seemed to slide off the table and it smashed. It could have been knocked, but Lee, Shane or John didn't seem to be near the table. We all ran out of the assembly hall, chills running down our spines. There were a lot of hurried footsteps making their way out of the school, but me, and also afterwards Lee, recalled hearing footsteps following behind us. We both admitted we were too scared to look. So that is the story of the first and last time I've used a Ouija board, and although nothing bad actually happened, I've decided that these unknown forces just aren't worth messing with. I live in a small hamlet in Shropshire in the UK. It was built around an old church that dated back to the 11th century and was a local and historical landmark. Unfortunately, the council didn't give a shit about it, and for as long as I've known, it has been abandoned and left to ruin. When I was growing up, the damage was so severe that the main hall had no ceiling and brickwork was falling to pieces. Vandals had salvaged lead and other metals, and the wooden doors had rotted off their hinges. This church still dominated our little hamlet, sitting atop a large hill that looked over the settlement of no more than 24 buildings. The hill itself was quite flat at the top and hosted a small graveyard. Nobody had been buried there since the 1700s, as there were no plots and most burials were now at a larger cemetery in the city. As such, the graves were much like the church itself, falling apart and in disrepair. Some of the oldest ones were so worn by the weather that names and dates could no longer be made out on them. As you can imagine, growing up in such a small place was boring, and there was only one other person my age who lived there. Kathy was my best friend and we did everything together. One time when we were about 14, our boredom reached a climax. We were old enough to want a bit more from our lives, yet too young to drive or go to the nearest city alone. It was a half-term break and our parents basically let us stay out till whenever, as we couldn't get in much trouble nor would much happen to us in a small little place where everyone knew everyone. We hatched a plan to go and use a Ouija board I had nicked out of my parents' wardrobe and contact the spirits buried at the church. It was 1 AM and a warm spring night when we made the short hike up the hill to the old church. Just me and Kathy. This night, a large full moon dominated the sky. It appeared almost light and we were without fear as we crept through the old stone archway and into the open hall. We sat on the floor in the middle of the aisle with nothing but an old Hasbro Ouija board, 2 torches, and each other. We had never read the rules and instantly began asking when we would die and how, and were inviting spirits to possess each other. Obviously, this was a big mistake, and after laughing and joking, I began to notice Kathy was becoming distant. She was staring into space, hardly talking and muttering one-word answers at best when I questioned her. It may have been the moonlight, but she even appeared to be quite pale in the face. She was deflecting or ignoring my questions now. And about 5 minutes after, I noticed her behaviour change. Her nose began bleeding. I had known Kathy for over a decade and had never known her to suffer from nosebleeds. She seemed unfazed and I took my hands off the planchette to see if she was okay. As soon as I did, she shrieked at me, telling me to put my fucking hands back on the planchette. I was scared and did as I was told. We sat there awkwardly as Kathy deliberately pulled the planchette from yes to no repeatedly, all the while blood pooling on her lap. After another 10 or so minutes of this, I decided I needed to pluck up the courage to get us out of here. I had a feeling I was dealing with something otherworldly, something paranormal, and that Kathy wasn't actually Kathy. I had to save my best friend. I let go of the planchette once again. She began shrieking at me and, I shit you not, began telling me to place my hands back on it, in a voice that sounded like an 80-year-old man. I meekly murmured, no, and Kathy flung her head back and made a gurgling sound before spitting on my shirt. Phlegm and blood mixed on it. I grabbed one of her wrists and pulled it off the planchette as I walked around the board to her side. Suddenly, Kathy slapped me across my face with the back of her hand so hard I went flying backwards onto the Ouija board. Now, if you thought the events so far were unbelievable, bear with me for the next part. I don't know if I actually saw this, or if it was shock from the slap, my imagination, or just a bird or something, but this is an account of the events that happened to me that night, and I can only recall them as I remember them. Now, as I flung back, my head twisted, and as I was falling, I remember seeing what appeared to be a woman in a tattered black gown which covered her face. It wasn't a shadow. I could make out finer details than just the darkness, and it appeared to have an arm outstretched, though I couldn't see if it was pointing or beckoning. And I hit the stone floor and lay there still for a moment. I remember pushing myself up, the old church spinning in my head. And I remember violently grabbing Kathy and hauling her out of the church, Kathy screaming, trying to loosen herself from my grip. And I remember how, as we left the graveyard and descended the hill, she seemed to calm and couldn't remember a thing. I remember everything, and so do my sleepless nights. We left the Ouija board and our torches up there that night, and since, I refused to even go near the place. Kathy doesn't remember a thing after the first few questions and never believed she hit me so hard that it cut my cheek. Ouija boards are not something I recommend you mess around with, but if you decide to, be prepared for the consequences. I had always had a close relationship with my grandma, and to tell you the truth, she was a cool woman. She was into witchcraft, the occult, and spiritualism. She had an impeccable record of safety up until her death a few years ago, aged 96, but she did slip up once, and it was my fault. I don't blame myself anymore. Being so close with her, I myself also had an interest in the occult and witchcraft, and for as long as I can remember, I had always wanted to use a Ouija board. My grandma was strictly against them, and I think my fascination with them stems from that and the almost mythical status they hold amongst Wiccans, occultists, and paranormal researchers. The night this happened, I was in my early 20s and I had been round at my grandma's to watch a movie, eat a pizza, and have a few glasses of wine. Despite my long interest in wanting to use a Ouija board, I have never acted upon it as I had a lot of respect for my grandma and her warnings. The movie had finished and we were sat talking. My grandma was telling me about the new spells she had added to her grimoire and showing me some new ingredients she had bought. The topic shifted on to Ouija boards. It didn't tend to usually. I never really pushed it as she had always been pretty stern regarding it, yet it somehow crept itself into the night's conversation. I never asked to use the Ouija board, but at one point my grandma sighed and said something along the lines of, "Lily, I'm getting old now. I'm experienced and I'll be damned if I go out afraid of something to do with the subjects that have given me and my life so much meaning." With this, she stood up and I honestly believed she was about to break the news that she had cancer or Alzheimer's. However, she shuffled over to the cupboard that was nestled next to her kitchen and pulled out an old damaged box covered in dust. She put it on the table and my heart fluttered as I saw it was an old Ouija board. Very old. I looked up at my grandma, still saying nothing. She smiled slightly. "There's no one else I'd rather try it with," she said. She lit candles around the whole house, turned off the lights and closed all the doors. She debriefed me on all the key rules which I'd already read about online. Don't let go of the planchette, remember to say goodbye, don't ask when or how you will die, etc. I was about to place my hand on the planchette when my grandma stopped me and asked if I was sure I wanted to do this. I did think about it for a moment and decided that yes, I did. My grandma told me that when she was young and foolish, her and one of her friends used this exact Ouija board to contact spirits, and it, quote-unquote, went dangerously wrong. She never did fully explain what happened, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both placed our hands on the planchette, and it instantly began circling. My grandma told me to stay strong, as this meant the spirit is trying to show us it's in charge. She said this with control, but I could see her flinching slightly. I was shaking, yet even so, the planchette was moving in almost perfect ovals. Out of nowhere, the planchette shot to each corner of the board, dragging us like ragdolls with it. I went to let go, but my grandma shouted, "No!" Then, the planchette slid from under both of our hands and hit the floor as though it weighed a ton. It hit and stuck. My grandma passed out and fell forward, cracking her head off the table, and I felt super dizzy. I put my grandma in the recovery position and went to call an ambulance. For some reason, the phone line was dead. I was trying to use the phone whilst watching my grandma, and because I was stressed, I began pacing and turned around to face the kitchen door. It was open. The lighting of the candles made the situation more daunting as I looked into the darkness of the kitchen. My mind was overacting, and I saw shadows moving from within. Suddenly, the kitchen door slowly began moving and closing. I dropped the phone and stood in petrified fear. Before I knew it, my grandma clasped my shoulder. "Quick, come help me." She had the Ouija board and planchette in her hands. She took us out to the garden and she burned it there and then. She told me similar had happened to her the last time she used it, and after the Ouija board had burnt out, we turned to head back in. We both saw it. A middle-aged woman, pale as the moon, deep sunken eyes and an evil look on her face. The description doesn't do it justice. It really doesn't. It was more terrifying than a horned demon, than a monster. The look on this woman's face was almost condescending, as if to say, "This plane is mine now." We burnt sage, and my grandma had her longtime friend, Father Ray, come and bless the house. Since my grandma's death, the house has been sold, but in the years I visited after this incident, me and my grandma both sensed the presence was still there. My grandma never went into too much detail. If you couldn't tell from this story, she never really did, but she did say this demon was malevolent and that it haunted her dreams. On her deathbed, she told me it was the only thing that scared her and that she hadn't made peace with, and that it was stalking her, getting closer and closer each day. Ultimately, this demon is what made her get cremated rather than buried. I never saw another full apparition of the demon, yet when visiting, I did see shadows disappearing around corners, and the house had a constantly depressing feel to it. My grandma had been in the business of occultism for nigh on 70 years, and even she struggled to cope with the power of a Ouija board. My advice? Don't go near them. Stay as far away from them as possible. It isn't a game. Growing up, I had always seen strange things. things I later found out were shadow people in our house. When I was old enough, I read about them online, but my case had always been a little bit different. A lot of people would wake up to see them at the end of their bed, and although the same shadows could recur, there were often a plethora of different shapes, sizes, and varieties. My haunting was different. It was always the same jagged shadow. It was semi-human in shape, but didn't really have a definitive human form, and it was always lingering around my mum. Sometimes she'd be in the kitchen and it would be behind her. Sometimes it would be stood next to her chair. Other times it would actually float and follow her from room to room, and sometimes it just wouldn't be there at all. I had grown up seeing this, so never actually said anything about it. It was normal to me, though my mum admitted that she should have picked up on it due to the fact that some of my behaviour as a baby was abnormal. You know, looking at things that weren't there, reaching out into nothingness. However, after reading about shadow people and after realising it wasn't exactly normal, I asked my mum what this shadow was and why I was seeing it. She instantly began crying and apologised, saying she had no idea that I could sense it. I was confused, and she sat me down and told me how, when she was a little girl, she used a spirit board with her twin sister. It took a turn for the worse due to their inexperience and stupidity, and apparently things got so intense the board snapped itself and the planchette pinged away and they could never find it, even when they moved out. My mum told me that since then, since that night over 25 years ago, she had been stalked by a terrifying shadow. She described it as perfectly as I saw it and told me that she no longer took notice of it. It was a strange phenomena, yet it had never harmed my mother. I'm now 26 years old, and when I go to visit my mum, I still sometimes see this shadow, and although it seems harmless, I swear each time I see it, it's getting closer and closer to her. Back in the early 90s, before me and my wife settled down and had a family, we would throw elaborate house parties for all of our friends. It was a weird situation. All of our friends and us basically lived on a secluded street in a small town on the southeast coast of England. Because of this, and despite 99% of us holding full-time jobs, there was a party at someone's house practically every single night. It was near Easter. I think it was 1992, but I'm not too sure, and we were hosting a party. Everyone turned up at about 7 PM in their hideous attire. You know, all the funky shapes and vibrant colours of the 90s. This night, things got pretty messy, and it was 3 AM, which I later found out is the witching hour, when about 7 of us decided to use a Ouija board that I had found in the loft the day before. It wasn't mine, nor was it my wife's, so I assumed it must have belonged to the previous owners. None of us took the session seriously. If I'm honest, until after this, I had never believed in the paranormal. I thought it was a load of malarkey. So we were all super drunk and fucking about, asking questions that I can't remember at all, when the lights from the 2 lamps we had on began flickering and the main light, right above our heads, suddenly blew. We all squealed and a couple of the blokes cheered, but how did that happen? We kept playing with the help of the 2 lamps and the board repeatedly spelled out evil. Any other time, you would nope the heck out of there, but again, because we were all drunk, we didn't take it seriously and thought maybe one of us was messing around. Then both the lamps blew. Us men, trying to act manly, pretended to be brave and reasoned it must have been a power surge. And I got 2 flashlights out of a drawer and shone it at the Ouija board. The planchette was spinning on its own. No one was even near it. We decided enough was enough, and I picked up the board and planchette and threw them into a cupboard before falling asleep on the couch. The next day, we could barely remember the Ouija board and could only really recall what I have previously written. Everyone had left by midday, and soon after is when really weird things began to happen. On more than one occasion, I would be sat watching TV only to feel as though I had just been covered in ice-cold water. I had calmed down to see a different show on TV. I had watched a full show without realising. A full 30 to 45 minutes, inexplicably gone. Other times her wife would be working. I'd be sat downstairs and would hear quick footsteps upstairs. There would be no one in but me. And at first I would investigate to see either nothing, or to see clothes on hangers shaking violently. It got to the point that I'd be too scared to go upstairs and look. Separately, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to hear creaking from downstairs. I would go into our dining room to see our ceiling light shaking heavily. It wouldn't lose momentum unless I stopped it, except for on one occasion when it abruptly stopped itself, dead, in its tracks. I knew this was on that blasted Ouija board, and the hauntings intensified. My wife would wake in the night screaming bloody murder and would be covered in bruises and scratches. I would wake unable to breathe, a heavy weight crushing my chest, invisible and intangible. We had a home alarm that on one occasion began sounding, and I quickly went downstairs with a hammer to see our front door wide open. I called the police, who came quickly and searched the house top to bottom. They found no one. One of the weirdest things was when I went to check the cupboard a few months later to retrieve the Ouija board, and I pulled everything out of that fucking cupboard, but there was no trace of a Ouija board. And I asked my wife had she moved it, and she said no. I asked all my friends if they had, and they all said no. It had vanished, and still, to this day, I have no idea where it went. Parties at our house came to a halt as friends didn't want to visit anymore. One guest had claimed she had been locked in the bathroom for over 10 minutes and was screaming, something me, or none of the other guests, heard. Another guest claimed she had had her hair pulled, and still more guests claimed to see shadow people and vintage wooden toys that would disappear into the darkness of some rooms, moved by some unknown, invisible force. The last straw came one day about a year after it all started. Me and my wife were both awoke to the sound of a thunderous crash and bang, and I rushed downstairs to see a large cabinet that pretty much covered the whole back wall, face down, on the living room floor, having crushed our TV and coffee table. We both looked in shock when heavy leather-bound books began firing at us, with some serious force. I did have some pictures developed of the damage done to the spines of these books, but over the years, I have lost them. I'm not exaggerating when I say, if these books, thrown by some phantom ghoul, had hit one of us, it could have killed us. We set about moving house the very next day. We were a nice couple and came clean to all who came to view the house, and the couple that bought it from us seemed unfazed by the haunting. We moved one street over so as to stay close to work, friends and parties, and family. The couple that moved in became quite good friends and told us nothing strange ever happened to them. Oddly, nothing unexplained or spooky happened to us again, and all the activity stopped. I know it sounds a bit far-fetched, and you've only got the word of an old gentleman on the internet to go off. But that's the true story of our haunting. Hi guys, Brothers Jackson here. Really hope you enjoyed that video. 5 True Scary Ouija Board Stories Volume 2. I thought there was a nice variety to those stories. Some of them more intense than others. Some of them just a one-off experience. Others like a progression to a full-blown haunting. I really enjoyed reading them. I hope you enjoyed listening. However, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more. Comment any ideas that you have for future videos. Hit that bell notification and go follow me on Instagram. Post on Instagram all the time at the minute because it's just dead handy to use. So go drop a follow over there and you can see what I've been doing with my day if you even care or whatever. So thank you very much for watching this, and hopefully I've got a few collaborations coming out in January time. Thanks very much for watching. Peace out.